What I can say is that the UK was not involved in any way in this operation. And as you'd expect, we're focusing on British nationals.
Look, I've got 2 daughters, Patrick, and I've never been so scared of the future of Britain. You know, I'm actively trying to see how maybe I can get out. I'm petrified for the future of my kids, especially my 2 girls. I'm pretty confident that if I left this studio now and went and randomly attacked 3 women, abused them, called them prostitutes and other names, that I would be arrested and I would expect to go to prison. Now, the fact that that hasn't happened is worrying to me. Again, I think we're seeing 2-tier policing, 2-tier justice, and we've got a 2-tier Prime Minister in this country and a 2-tier media, the way things are treated.
Britain has been thrown into political chaos. Inside Westminster, anger is boiling over as MPs from across the chamber move to trigger a no-confidence vote against Prime Minister Keir Starmer. What was meant to be a government of stability is now facing its most dangerous moment yet. Starmer, who promised to respect the democratic will of the British people, stands accused of betraying the 17 million voters who backed Brexit. Corridors buzz with fury, disbelief, and panic. Senior figures privately admit this is unlike anything they have seen before. The government is shaking, and Britain's political future suddenly feels dangerously uncertain. What is unfolding inside Westminster goes far beyond a routine political dispute. According to senior insiders, the atmosphere around Number 10 is tense and volatile, with decisions being made behind closed doors at breathtaking speed. Even experienced MPs admit they have never witnessed such a fragile moment for a sitting Prime Minister. Keir Starmer is said to be furious, isolated, and under relentless pressure from all sides. While official statements attempt to project calm, the reality is very different. This feels less like normal politics and more like the opening stages of a historic political collapse. If you want to know what is really happening behind closed doors in Westminster, don't look away. Subscribe now to stay informed, challenge official narratives, and follow every development as pressure mounts on Keir Starmer and his government. The crisis exploded when Keir Starmer openly signalled a decisive shift back towards Brussels. In recent statements, he confirmed his intention to push Britain into closer alignment with the European Union, including deeper access to the single market. For millions of voters, this was the moment their worst fears were confirmed. Brexit, they were told, meant taking back control. Yet Starmer's language suggested the opposite, a gradual reversal delivered piece by piece. Across Westminster, accusations of betrayal spread rapidly. MPs who once defended compromise now speak of a broken promise. Brexit supporters see not pragmatism, but deception. What had simmered quietly for months suddenly ignited into open revolt. This was no longer a technical policy debate. It became a question of trust, legitimacy, and whether the 2016 referendum still holds any meaning in modern Britain. Anger intensified when the practical consequences of the government's EU deals became clear. Britain had agreed to extend European fishing access to UK waters for 12 more years, pushing control out to 2038. For coastal communities, this felt like a knife in the back. Fishermen who were promised the return of their waters after Brexit now watched those same waters signed away across a negotiating table. Industry leaders warned that livelihoods were being sacrificed to appease Brussels, with no meaningful consent from Parliament. The fury did not stop at fishing. The government also accepted regulatory alignment on food and agriculture, handing oversight to European institutions. Under the agreement, the European Court of Justice would have the final say on standards affecting British farmers and consumers. Critics argued that this stripped British courts of authority and reversed one of Brexit's core achievements. For many voters, sovereignty ceased to be an abstract concept. It became tangible, measured in lost income, weakened industries, and decisions made by distant officials. The sense of betrayal deepened as communities realised these concessions were not temporary compromises, but long-term commitments. Trust, once damaged, now appeared dangerously close to collapse. This is the moment when the crisis reaches its breaking point. As confidence in the government collapses, the political ground beneath Westminster begins to move. Polling now shows Reform UK surging ahead of both Labour and the Conservatives, signalling a potential realignment unseen in modern British history. For the first time, the idea of an alternative government no longer feels theoretical, it feels imminent. At the centre of this shift stands Nigel Farage, increasingly spoken of as a future Prime Minister rather than a protest figure. Supporters argue that he is simply articulating what millions already believe, that Brexit is being dismantled in slow motion. Seat projections paint a devastating picture for Labour, suggesting historic losses that would reduce the party to a shadow of its former strength. What once looked like an unassailable landslide victory now appears frighteningly fragile. The tension intensifies further with explosive warnings from Dominic Cummings, who claims elements of the political establishment will do whatever it takes to prevent reform from taking power. His allegations of behind-the-scenes manoeuvring have sent shockwaves through Westminster, reinforcing the belief among voters that the system is closing ranks against them. For viewers, this is the point of realisation. The crisis is no longer just about Keir Starmer's leadership or Labour's direction. It is about whether power is slipping away from the political class altogether. The question hangs heavily in the air. If the old order is collapsing, what comes next? And who will be left standing when it does? By this stage, the crisis is no longer driven solely by opposition attacks or public anger. It is being fuelled from within. The Labour Party, barely 18 months after its historic landslide, is tearing itself apart in full view of the country. More than 130 Labour MPs have now signalled opposition to key elements of the government's agenda, an extraordinary figure that represents over a quarter of the parliamentary party. This is not dissent at the margins. It is an organised rebellion. 13 Labour MPs have openly voted against their own government on proposals linked to closer ties with the European Union, directly contradicting manifesto commitments. Others have signed amendments attempting to block flagship legislation, including welfare reforms that critics warn will push hundreds of thousands into poverty. Private briefings have become public leaks. WhatsApp groups, once used for coordination, are now platforms for open hostility. Party discipline, long regarded as Labour's greatest strength, has visibly collapsed. Inside Westminster, MPs speak candidly of a leadership that has lost its authority. Keir Starmer is increasingly described as isolated, relying on a shrinking circle of advisors, while large sections of his party simply stop listening. The language used by Labour insiders has shifted from loyalty to survival. Many now frame their decisions not around party unity, but around whether they can keep their own seats at the next election. Attention has inevitably turned to succession. Health Secretary Wes Streeting is widely discussed as a potential challenger, particularly after publicly contradicting the Prime Minister on EU-related policy. Political observers interpret his comments as a calculated signal rather than an accident. At the same time, Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham has emerged as another possible alternative, openly criticising the government's welfare direction and accusing ministers of abandoning Labour's traditional base. What makes this moment so dangerous is not merely ambition, but timing. With local elections approaching, MPs fear being dragged down by association with an increasingly unpopular leader. Some privately admit that removing Starmer early may be the only way to limit electoral damage. Others worry that any leadership contest would deepen the chaos and accelerate the collapse. Either way, paralysis has set in. The result is a governing party that appears to be functioning on autopilot. Cabinet ministers brief against one another. Backbenchers defy the whip without fear. Policy announcements are drowned out by rumours of resignations and plots. For the public, the image is unmistakable. A party that won power, promising stability, now looks incapable of governing itself. This internal civil war marks a decisive turning point. A government can survive opposition hostility. It can even endure public anger for a time. What it cannot survive is the loss of authority over its own ranks. At this moment, Labour no longer looks like a party in control of government. It looks like a party preparing for defeat. At this stage, the crisis has moved far beyond party politics or the fate of a single Prime Minister. What is now unfolding strikes at the foundations of British democracy itself. Britain does not rely on a written constitution. It depends on conventions, restraint, and the principle that power flows from Parliament and, ultimately, from the people. When those conventions are weakened, the entire system becomes unstable. The anger directed at Keir Starmer is no longer limited to Brexit policy. MPs from across the political spectrum are warning that the manner in which these decisions have been pursued represents a dangerous precedent. Major changes to Britain's relationship with Europe were negotiated without clear electoral consent and with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. For many MPs, this feels like executive power stretching beyond its democratic limits. Constitutional experts have begun raising the alarm. If a Prime Minister can commit the country to long-term international agreements, surrender regulatory authority, and reshape migration frameworks without full parliamentary debate, then what remains of parliamentary sovereignty? The concern is not simply what has been agreed, but how easily it was done. Once that line is crossed, future leaders may feel entitled to bypass Parliament whenever it becomes inconvenient. Within Westminster, frustration has hardened into fear. MPs are openly asking whether the referendum of 2016 still holds any binding force. If a clear democratic mandate can be gradually reversed through technical agreements and regulatory alignment, then the value of any future vote is called into question. Today, it is Brexit. Tomorrow, it could be taxation, defence, or civil liberties. The principle is the same. This sense of democratic erosion has fueled a broader loss of trust. Voters who already feel disconnected from politics now see proof of their worst suspicions, that decisions are made by a small political class insulated from public accountability. The language used by critics is no longer rhetorical. They speak of a system drifting away from consent and towards managerial control. The breakdown is visible inside the government itself. Cabinet ministers publicly contradict one another on core policy. Collective responsibility, a cornerstone of British governance, appears to have collapsed. When senior figures cannot agree on the direction of the country, confidence in the machinery of state evaporates. Markets notice, international partners notice, most importantly, voters notice. This is why the current moment feels so dangerous. A democracy can survive unpopular decisions. It can survive lost elections and political turnover. What it cannot survive indefinitely is the perception that votes no longer matter. Once that belief takes hold, disengagement turns to anger, and anger turns to instability. Britain now stands at a constitutional crossroads. The question is no longer whether this government has made mistakes, but whether the democratic guardrails that once limited power are still holding. If they fail, the consequences will extend far beyond one Prime Minister or one party. They will redefine how Britain is governed for generations to come. The final judgment on this crisis will not be delivered inside Westminster. It will come from the British people themselves. The local elections scheduled for May 2026 now loom as a decisive moment, widely seen as a referendum on trust, sovereignty and democratic accountability. For Keir Starmer, they represent a test of political survival. For voters, they represent something far more profound. Across the country, frustration has hardened into resolve. Constituencies once considered safely Labour are showing dramatic swings, particularly in the so-called Red Wall. Communities that lent Labour their support in the hope of stability now speak openly of betrayal. The warning signs are unmistakable. If these trends hold, Labour faces losses on a scale not seen in generations, placing unbearable pressure on a leader already fighting for legitimacy. At the same time, Reform UK is positioning itself as the vehicle for protest and renewal. Its message is simple and direct. Brexit was a democratic instruction, not a suggestion. By promising to tear up agreements that dilute sovereignty and restore firm control over borders and lawmaking, the party has tapped into a deep well of anger and disillusionment. Supporters believe this moment offers a rare chance to reset British politics entirely, yet the stakes extend beyond party fortunes. What is being tested is whether democratic mandates still carry real authority. If a referendum result can be quietly reshaped through technical deals and regulatory alignment, then the meaning of consent itself is weakened. Many voters now ask a fundamental question. If our biggest decision can be undone, what protection does any future vote truly have? This is why the coming months feel like a reckoning. MPs will be forced to choose between party loyalty and electoral reality. Institutions will be tested on whether they can adapt without losing public trust. Citizens will decide whether disengagement continues or whether participation becomes an act of defence rather than habit. History shows that democracies do not usually collapse in dramatic moments. They erode gradually through indifference and quiet compromise. But history also shows that renewal is possible when citizens refuse to accept the unacceptable. The British political system now stands at that threshold. The future of Brexit, the credibility of Parliament, and the legitimacy of those who govern all hang in the balance. Whether this crisis ends in resignation, realignment, or renewal will depend not on closed-door negotiations, but on the collective will of voters. In the end, sovereignty does not belong to governments or institutions. It belongs to the people, and the choice of whether to defend it now rests firmly in their hands. Britain is approaching a decisive moment. What began as a political dispute has become a test of trust, sovereignty, and democratic integrity. The coming months will reveal whether Keir Starmer can survive this storm, or whether the public will deliver a clear verdict at the ballot box. History is shaped not only by those in power, but by those who choose to act when it matters most. If this story has made you question where Britain is heading, stay informed, stay engaged, and make your voice heard. Democracy endures only when citizens refuse to look away.